Hi everybody, Steve Farmer once again, and I'm going to bring you just one game in this video. And it's a very nice game from a very special player. But before we get into that, let's discuss what's happening for the Scorpions as they enter yet another postseason berth. In the last matchup, the Week 10 of the U.S. Chess League, Arizona defeated the Carolina Cobras by 2.5 to 1.5. There were 3 draws and 1 decisive game, and we're going to look at that decisive game here today. But before we get on with that, I'd like to give the standings as they are right now and what's coming up in the postseason play. So Arizona finished the season with 5.5 to 4.5. It should have been 6.5 to 3.5, but the dispute with the Rogelio Barcenia game gave that win over to the opposing team. So it knocked a full point into the wrong direction for Arizona. Now Arizona will be taking on the St. Louis Archbishops, who are 6.5 to 3.5. And this will be the second meeting between these two teams, and Arizona won the first matchup this year by 2.5 to 1.5. While the lineups have not yet been announced, I'm sure that you can find that probably Sunday night on USChessLeague.com. I can assure you that both teams are going to put up their best lineups possible, as it's win or go home at this point. To tide you over until the playoff starts, today we'll look at a game between Mackenzie Molner, who's rated 25-11, playing white for Arizona, and they'll be taking on Carolina's Jonathan Schroer, who is rated 24-14. He is an international master. Now, last year, Mac won the league's Most Improved Player award, and this year he shows that he has not lost his feel for the board. Now, Mac is a rare talent. He's a romantic player, and that's for sure. And with a name like Mackenzie, one would only assume it is a proper fit for his playing style to go along with his name. But I'd like to explain a little more about Mac's style. And we can do this by way of an analogy. Now, we've often heard sports announcers for football or basketball or boxing use chess as a comparison. Oh, we have a real chess match going on here. Well, we're going to flip the tables on them a bit. Now, there are very solid chess players out there who play like some NFL teams or some soccer teams. They depend on their defense. You know, one goal a game may be all they need. One field goal may be all they need, because they rely so heavily on their strong defense. Others are opportunistic tacticians. That's probably where I would fall into. It's something akin to basketball players. They see an opportunity and they exploit it to their fullest. But to me, there's one sport that is the ultimate sport. I place it above football, above basketball, above boxing, and yes, I even place it above mixed martial arts. But no, the most daring sport, the most demanding athletically, is the dogfight. And I'm not talking Michael Vick here. I'm talking fighter pilots. Now, from my time in the service, I've hung around with a lot of fighter pilots. And my time after the service, I've known people that made it to the NBA, the NFL, and I've had several Olympic track champions living here at my properties. None of them, none, can compare to the top-notch fighter jock. So this is a bit of a Veterans Day salute, as well as showcasing Mackenzie Molner's game here. But anybody who's sat around playing video game simulators, you know, these war games, you're playing a part of a World War II plane or something like that, or even dogfights from the First World War simulators, you know it can get very disoriented from flying around in loops and circles and scissor rolls and stuff like that. It can get very disoriented. But add to that G-forces, add to that chunks of ice flying out of your air conditioning vents to evaporate completely before they hit your face. A strange sensation, but it happens. You get these flecks of ice coming at you, but they disappear. Add to that the sweat that you have from your helmet and it pouring down your body as you're fighting off the G-forces. Add to that some of the moves you have to make are not expected. For example, say you have somebody coming way off in front of you from your 2 or 3 o'clock position, and they're going to be flying right in front of you at the 12 o'clock position. Well, do you want to fire a burst at them and hope you get lucky? No, that's the wrong thing to do. For 2 reasons. The chances of hitting them in a direct shot like that from any kind of distance is very, very tiny. The other thing is you might wake the guy up. He may not even know that you're there. So if you fire a shot at him, you're going to let him know you're there. No, what you do when a guy is flying in front of you like that, you're going to do an attacking barrel roll. Yes, you can't just turn on your signal and turn left to go after the guy. So as he's getting toward your 12 o'clock, you want to kind of see where he's going and start to have a slight increase in your altitude. And then if you see him turn back towards you, then you go into this attacking barrel roll, which means you go up and in the opposite direction of which way he was coming in the first place. And then you turn back the opposite direction, and after you went up, you were losing altitude. So he's still going by pretty fast, but you're losing some altitude. And now you're making the turn back down to try and come in behind him. And that is the attacking barrel roll. So that'll bring you around in behind him. Sometimes you have to get into a scissor movement behind him to get right on at 6 o'clock if he's aware of you. Now, if he's not aware of you, by the time you made this turn, you're going to come in directly behind him and shoot him down. So there's a lot of thinking going on. But there's a lot of G-forces on you when you're doing something like this. So you have to be very fit athletically. Now, when I was in the Air Force, I was very fortunate to have flown several times in fighters, and extremely fortunate that I was able to get involved in 3 dogfight scenarios. They were all practice, but they were the real thing as far as the pressures and demands on your body. And in each one of those, I came very close to blacking out. I mean, I got tunnel vision so bad that I could only focus in on a screw holding one of the instrument panels in. That's how close I was to blacking out. These guys put up with it every time they go out. So, a big salute to the fighter pilots out there. Well, these guys have very acute vision. This is the one thing that kept me from going to flight school. They would see, now this is an example, I would be up with them and they'd go, I saw a wing flash. I'd go, what? I'd say, where? And he'd say, up in the distance over there, you know, at 10 o'clock, something like that. By the time I noticed the flash that he was talking about, and that's what they look for is a wing flash, and at that point they don't know if it's an enemy or a friendly or what it is. It's just a bogey. We don't know what it is. And then by the time I looked at it and saw the flash, he called in a tally-ho, which meant that it was a bandit, that it was a bad guy. He actually identified this plane when it's still about 15 miles away. So these guys were athletic, they were fit, they were mentally sharp, they had their game on. But one thing that might surprise you about fighter pilots is that they know their game. They know that they have to, if they can't get a straight-on shot on somebody, they may have to open themselves up to some kind of tactic that they can properly counter. And this means that they may be putting themselves into danger. For example, let's say you have somebody on your 5 or 6 o'clock, and they're getting ready to lock guns on you. You know, you may be too close for a sidewinder or something like that. So they may be going to lock guns on you. What is the best thing you can do? So if they're at your 5 o'clock, don't you think that that means that you'd want to go to your left? Well, no, that would actually be a critical mistake because you're still going to be within his turn radius and he's going to come after you and be able to bring it around, especially if it has a lighter, more maneuverable plane. Now, what you want to do is you want to cross his flight path. And that's going to put you in danger for a moment. That's what they call the snapshot. It's basically a flash second that they could press the guns and hit you. But by the time you made up your mind to make that move, you've already gotten past the zone where the bullets would fly. Because the human mind, as sharp as these guys are, by the time you pull the trigger and the bullets fly through the air to where you think you're going to hit, you're behind the plane in a sharp turn. Or if you come up behind a plane, it's in one of those identify missions. You're pulling up to it, trying to get it to identify itself, put its wheels down. In all the scenarios we've gone through, the plane breaks away. So say we're coming up to them on like their 4 o'clock, trying to give them instructions to lower their gear, and then all of a sudden they break to the left real hard. What do? Do you turn around to the left and go after them? No, because if you did that, you'd be in their jet wash. You'd be a tumbling target. Now, what you do is There's several different options. There's the Immelman. There's a lot of different ways to turn, or you can completely turn in the opposite direction. They go left, you go right. And you come back around, and you'll be able to do an attacking barrel roll on them. You come in behind them. That's the idea. So there's a lot of thinking that goes on to this, but there's a lot of danger, and they purposely put themselves in these dangerous positions from time to time to get their opponent to make an even bigger mistake. So this long-winded explanation of fighter pilots and that style of fighting, I think really encapsulates the approach that Mackenzie Molner has to the game of chess. You know, if we turn this discussion back to Mackenzie totally, and get away from the fighter pilots for a moment, and relate it to chess, we can remember the saying of Philidor saying that the pawns are the soul of chess. And then later on we see Paul Morphy, who didn't have a disdain for pawns, but they often got in his way to a point where he would just jettison. He'd give them away to his opponent so his pieces would get more scope. Well, I see the opening as being Mackenzie's pawns. He wants to get through the opening, get into a tactical and open position, if possible, to bring his game to the opponent. He seems to really love the open game. He plays the fried liver. He plays the Evans Gambit. I wouldn't be surprised if you'd see him playing a King's Gambit or maybe a Garing Gambit or something like that in the future from time to time. But he's a very, very aggressive open field player. Now, to call him a romantic, yes, I guess his openings are romantic openings, but he's playing in modern times. It's not so simple to just say he's a romantic player. He's a risk taker. But it's a calculated risk, just like the fighter pilots do. Okay, without any further ado, let's press forward with the game itself and see what happens there. Alright, e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Bishop c4, bishop c5. Now, I think he plays the Evans Gambit here because he doesn't want to get into the Traxler. So here he opts for b4. And it's wheels up, and he's on the roll. Bishop takes b4, c3, bishop a5 here. Now, bishop e7 is the second most popular choice, and now bishop d6 is really starting to come into some light of its own. It's been played many, many times, but I think that it's going to become more and more popular. But bishop a5 is still, by far, the most popular choice. d4, and now e takes d4 is the most popular line. He did not play that. Jonathan played d6. Now queen to b3, queen to d7, now knight b to d2. Alright, let's take a step back and look at the most common move here. That would be d takes e5. Now, there's nothing wrong with Mac's move. As a matter of fact, I have not kept up on the advances in the Evans Gambit for many, many years, so there's probably books out there that are really praising the virtue of Mac's move of knight b to d2 instead of this. But let's just take a look at this as a little refresher of the Evans Gambit. Most common here is bishop to b6, but if d takes e5, then we can get castling, bishop b6 and rook to d1. I think white has a slight edge and more than enough compensation for the pawn. But back here after bishop to b6, knight b d2, knight to a5, queen to c2, knight takes the bishop, knight takes knight, and now I think with d5, I think the game is pretty level. I think black is starting to free things up, and he's going to have a decent game. He's also got the bishop pair. So that was on d takes e5. But Mac played knight b to d2. This kind of keeps things hanging into balance a little bit. Maybe black will make a non-essential move. He doesn't. He plays something that's pretty typical. He plays bishop b6. And now Mac plays a4. And this is an odd duck of this opening. And Mac is well versed in this line. And he's already preparing to sack the exchange here. And it's only move 9. Now, he could transpose back into mainline stuff with d takes e5, knight a5, queen c2, and yada yada. We've seen this before, and d5 is going to transpose back into the main lines that we're talking about. But a4 here is a unique bird. And now e takes d4 is the most popular, but it really has poor results. So I think that Schroer's line of knight f6 is the most stodgy defense. And now a5. And I gotta tell you, the computer really does not like this move. It's not even in the top 5 choices. But there are a couple games with this in there. And we come to the first point of the analogy between Mac's play and that of a fighter pilot in a dogfight. The fighter pilot in a dogfight is going to want to create opportunities of risk, to present opportunities to the opponent to go wrong. Now here he's willing to give up his work on A1 for either the knight on C6 or the bishop on B6. One of those two pieces is going to be gone from the board for the work on A1. What does that do? Well, as we will see, that is going to give white quite a bit of commanding control in the center. And the center, in an open board, is primary real estate. That's what you want. You want to have control of the center. In a closed game, say the pawn was on D5 and things were locked up, yeah, you don't want to sack your rook then. But here, this piece on A1 is about equal to the knight or the bishop. So it's an educated guess. Now, if the game goes long and goes into an endgame, yeah, black's going to have the advantage. But the whole objective of white is to make a really complicated position where the game will not get to an endgame. Alright, so play continued with knight takes A5. He gives up the knight instead of the bishop. I don't think that it makes too much difference, but it seems most logical. Because if you can end up with the bishop pair out of the deal, you might be better off. So rook takes. And this is an offer that really cannot be refused, so bishop takes, and d takes e5. So we can see that the center will soon be dissolved. The real question here is, will white's domination of the center be enough to give full compensation? Well, objectively, probably not. Subjectively, in a human-to-human contest, probably so. This is the daring that Mac brings to the game. And I'm sure it causes a lot of consternation among his teammates and fans. It's very tough to sit back and watch Mac play if you're a fan of the Scorpions. It's very tough. You have to have a lot of faith in the man. And fortunately, after watching him play a few times, I have tremendous faith in this guy. He's a very good player. Now, would he be able to play this way against the uber elite, the Anands, the Topolovs, the Carlsons? Perhaps not at the level he's at right at this moment, but give him a little bit more time, a little more high echelon playing time. He may well be able to pull it off against people of that ilk as well. But right now, he's really a class above a lot of these players that he comes up against. Even against Julio Becerra when he played the fried liver. His technique was not perfect, but Julio's was even worse. And that's the point of his play. Who really studies this stuff? Who sits down as black and says, I'm going to concentrate on a solid line in the Evans Gambit? Not me. I've never done it. I've studied it as white. I go, this is fun for white, but I never bothered to study it as black. Here, Jonathan does make the correct move. He plays knight to g4. The idea of bringing the knight here is to try and either A, contribute to the center defense, or B, at the very worst, come back to h6 and defend the f7 pawn. So, it's a good move. Now, let's take a step back, because there is another possibility, though it looks kind of crazy at first. D takes e5. Alright, well, this looks like it has a fly in the ointment right from the start, because knight takes e5. But now there's queen to e7. The idea is black still wants to try and castle. Now, white could interrupt the castling with bishop takes f7, king to f8, f4, bishop b6, but this looks pretty equal to me. White's not going to be able to castle either. And black has a passed a pawn out of this deal too, and he's the exchange up. So I would give this no more as equal at best. And then there's knight takes f7. Well, black can just castle after this. It looks scary that there's a discovered check there, but there's really nothing to be gained from it. Black is still up the exchange. So I think for white, the best way to try and play for a winner is with queen to a4 check. A knight to d7. Well, you know, this looks like it's just picking up a piece, but it's not really. Because after knight to d7, white has to deal with that right away because knight on e5 is hit. So knight takes, bishop takes c3. Now we can get a discovered check in with the knight, but now bishop to d7 hits the queen. So you got to deal with that. And now c6. and that knight's about ready to fall. No matter where it goes, it's going to be picked off. Well, I guess he could go knight to b6 here. Bishop takes d2, bishop takes, queen takes e4, bishop e2, queen takes g2, rook f1, and rook to d8. You know, we have 3 pieces versus a rook and 4 pawns. I'd like white here, but I'm not sure that I could say that white is winning. Very strange position here. I wouldn't want to be either player, let's put it that way. So going back here after c6, white can castle, and take the knight, now knight f3, and this is just positionally looking pretty good for white. He's got 2 pieces for a rook and 2 pawns. Now materially that's not a great trade, but in this case I think that he's got more than enough compensation. So that's sidetracking though back here. He could have played d takes e5. Very risky line for both players. So instead, knight to g4 played by Jonathan seemed to be the right path. Now Mac plays e takes d6. This is a bit of a divergence from a previous game where h3 was played. And this is from the game of Trent versus Howell in England 2008, where knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, and bishop a3 was played. The idea here was to prevent black from castling on kingside. But this only proved to be a temporary inconvenience for black, who went on to win the game after c6. In our game, though, Mac played e takes d6, and now black decides to castle. Going back, castling is the right way to go. If c takes d6, there's a big problem with that. Bishop b5. And if queen takes d6, then queen to a4 check is going to grab that bishop on a5. So castling is the right move. Now h3. And this is not giving the knight time to return to e5 because there's no support to it. So knight h6. Now bishop a3. And c takes d6. Black is up the exchange and a pawn. And he's got a little bit of a foothold in the center. At least he's guarding the critical e5 square. Now, if white can undermine that square at some point in the game, he's going to have very good chances. But I think that on a totally objective level, you'd have to say black is doing just fine here. On a subjective level, you'd have to say, well, you know, black looks like he can defend, but I don't know. It's kind of shaky. Pawn on d6 is a little bit weak. The king side's kind of in a weird array. The knight's on h6, not f6. Yeah, and he's undeveloped. His queen, bishop, and queen, rook have yet to get into the game. So those are some offsetting factors, but how heavily do they weigh on the total evaluation of the position? Well, in a human mind, they mean a good psychological advantage. From a silicon beast like Houdini or something like that, it doesn't care. It says, I'll suffer the slings and arrows of a bad position for the material. Well, there's a difference between humans and computers. Now, Mac castles in this position, which is a novelty for the game. But let's go back. Let's look at the game between Koleos and Gonda from Rome, 2011. That continued with g4. Now, this looks a bit disconcerting for black because the pawn's ready to come up the board and start shattering things open. But black has some counterplay here. b5, bishop takes b5, queen to c7, hitting the c-pawn, queen to c4, rook to b8, queen takes queen, bishop takes queen, bishop c4, bishop e6, bishop to d3, kind of getting pushed back. This is not what you want to be doing as white. f6. Black's starting to get pretty solid, and this game ended up being a draw in 84 moves. And we're not going to go through all those. So back in our game, though, Mac decided to hold off on any advancements and played castles. Now bishop b6, very utilitarian move in this opening. And bishop to d5. Okay, this is kind of an odd looking move. It needs a little explanation. It's not that it's targeting the b pawn, but rather white would like to play e5. Now, if we go back here and white played e5, after black takes on e5, white can't really play knight takes e5 because the knight on d2 is hanging. But with this move inserted, the possibility of playing e5 becomes very real for white. And if he gets that move in, he's going to own and dominate the center. That is Mac's plan. That, and it also opens up the square c4 for the knight, or e4 if e5 gets played. Playing on an open board is much different than playing in a semi or a closed position. You have to think about the most aggressive, positive squares for your pieces to be on. And then you have to play this little puzzle game of moving this piece here and that piece there and that piece there in an economical fashion, the quickest way possible, the most effective way possible, so that you can still maintain your lead in development and get your pieces in more dominating attacking positions. And Mac is very good at this. Now, it seems that the pressure started getting a little too much on Mr. Schroer, and he plays king to h8 here, trying to relieve the pressure on the f7 pawn so that maybe he could play f6 and stop the move e5 from coming in. But, you know, just a quick look here, bishop c5 was a better way to go. This is like turning into the oncoming fire that I was talking about. If you have an enemy behind you and he's trying to shoot you down, you can have some tricks to get out of it. Now, black has many different problems to contend with here. Lack of development. King is not totally secure. He's not busted open yet, but he's not totally secure. And then there's the pressure on the dark squares here as well. So which one has to be dealt with first? Well, in this case, I think the dark square problem first, and then king safety after that. So bishop c5 made a little more sense. But okay, king h8 is not losing the game. Now e5, and after this, the center is destroyed and white dominates in the center. This, I think, gives full and complete compensation for the material that white is down. Now, Jonathan did play bishop c5 here, and now the computers want to play knight to e4. Mac played bishop to b2, and I'll explain why. But first, let's go back and let's look at why knight e4 was professed by the computers to be the best. To hold the edge for white. Okay. Now, there's a couple choices here for black. What does he do? He can try f6, try and combat this danger in the center here, but now he play knight takes bishop, pawn takes, bishop takes c5, hitting the rook, rook to e8, pawn takes, g takes, rook to d1, now queen to g7. Okay, black is up to pure exchange, and he's managed to trade off a little bit of material to help consolidate his position somewhat. If he can get his queen rook into the game, he's going to have total equality. I think black can hold this. And so after knight to e4, you try bishop takes a3. Now queen takes a3, f6 again, knight takes d6, queen to e7, pinning the knight, rook to e1, and now fe5 would be a big mistake here, just simply because of knight takes e5. We're threatening knight d to f7, and in some cases knight e to f7. Black is just lost here. But after bishop to d7, bishop takes b7, rook a to d8, c4, knight f7, c5, fe5, knight f7, queen f7, c6, bishop c8, queen a7. Things are actually pretty much level here. Let's face one fact, folks. You're looking at that. You're looking at this position from here. Got all that? Yeah. And how do you judge this position? Just looking at it with it on the board, how do you judge it? White better? Black better? What's going on? Try and figure that out from back here. So we can see the sense now of the move bishop to b2. He's getting behind a pawn. That's a blocked bishop. There's 3 pawns in the way, 2 of his own and 1 of the enemy. But it is aiming in on the black king. It's like pulling in behind your enemy playing on his 6 o'clock. You're ready to put the pipper on him and fire away. You just got to wait for the right time. D takes e5 was played. And now I thought Mac would continue with knight takes pawn. He didn't. He played knight to e4, which is a good move. Knight takes e5 is okay. I thought he should have played this, but queen to c7, knight to d3, bishop to e7, c4, and f6. And black is up the exchange and a pawn, and I think he's starting to consolidate his position somewhat. So technically this might be the best way to go, but practically in a game between humans, knight to e4. Now this is leaving the exchange and 2 pawns down, but it is getting his pieces into a more aggressive stance, and it is giving his opponent even more room, more latitude to make mistakes of his own. Now, bishop to e7 was played. If you tried to hold on to the pawn with bishop to d6, it just doesn't work out because you take, he takes, bishop to a3, queen to d8, take the rook, queen takes, knight takes e5, f6, knight f3, and now white is only down a pawn, and I think he has more than enough compensation for the pawn here. That's why Jonathan played bishop to e7 instead of bishop to d6. And it just gives up this pawn, so black is back to being an exchange and a pawn up rather than two pawns up. And now queen to e8. I don't know if I would quite call this a mistake. I thought that queen to c7 was a little better, at least a tiny bit more accurate. But yeah, queen to e8. Okay, now in a fight, in a dog fight or in a chess game, you'd really like to take a chance to catch your breath. Well, in a dog fight, you don't have time. In chess, you have a little bit of time that you can catch your breath, maybe get up, get some coffee or something. But it doesn't really change your mindset. Sometimes getting away from the board, though, does help you out. I've been in instances where I'm at a critical position. I just get up and walk around so that I can sit back at the board with a fresh, new outlook on things. But there are tells, just like in poker. There are tells in the game of chess. Now, queen to e8's a rather passive move. Wouldn't you agree? Queen to c7 is a more aggressive move. It's hitting the knight on e5, posing the question to white, what are you going to do with the knight? Now, if you go in for mass trades on f7, I don't think black's too worried about that. The queen to e8 is a bit passive, so that's got to tell Mac that he's got his opponent a bit on the run. So now Mac plays c4. And now the bishop on b2 is armed and ready. Once he hears a growl in his headset, he's ready to fire. Again, in the strictest sense, judging from the computer's evaluation, black is just fine here. Just fine. Right. If you've ever had anybody narrowing in on your 6 o'clock and you know they got missiles and guns, there are two important factors to you. How do I get out of this mess? And exactly where are the ejection seat handles? Alright, so Jonathan plays f6 here, and I think that's the right move. It's an attempt to bolster the pawn structure around his king. Yes, it makes his light squares a bit weak, but it's trying to bolster at least the dark squares. Mac plays knight f3. Now, people that have seen my videos before have heard this explanation more than one time. Let's go back. Seems like the most natural looking move here is to play knight to d3 so that it can come to f4 maybe, or help to push the pawn to c5 or something like that. Let's go back. That's a rather obvious looking move. So what happens when you play the rather unobvious looking move of retreating it back to f3? It makes your opponent wonder even still more about what's going on. Where's that knight going to? d4? h4? g5? He doesn't know. So just by an innocuous little move, you may make your opponent use 15, 20 seconds more than they normally would. And that can be critical when you're getting down into a time crunch. And here, it could actually make him think for a few minutes more. So if you have an obvious move and a rather unobvious move that are both about equal weight, I'd go for the rather unobvious looking move. And I'll tell you, Mac seems to have a gift with this. I've seen him do it over and over and over in these chess league games. Alright, Jonathan comes up with the right plan and he fights back by trying to create some kind of counterattack with a5. He's just trying to shrug off White's attack with his own counterattack. Now, again, there are better moves than this, but c5 is a rather unexpected move, and that's what Mac played. He's still trying to get his opponent to eat up more time and to keep open a position where the possibility of making mistakes is wide open. a4, queen to c3. Again, this is a move that is probably better subjectively than objectively. After all, who wants to sit there facing the queen and bishop battery bearing down on your king? Now, queen to b5 was played. Now, just as in a dogfight, the pursued tries desperately to become the aggressor. But surprisingly, the more passive-looking move, queen to d8, was a little better, adding a little bit of more bolstering to the dark squares and trying to get some piece control on the center. Play here might continue with queen to c4, a3, bishop to c3, queen to c7, bishop to b4, or knight to d4. Rook to d8, knight to c3, and now bishop to d7. This is a very human move. To be honest, the computer likes to move rook to a5. Now, who's going to find this in this kind of time pressure? This is absolutely crushing, but it's not a very human-like move. So let's be fair about it, because after bishop takes a5, queen takes a5, this pawn is hit, so knight to e4, now b6, and the threat is bishop to a6, so white can't really take that pawn on b6, so he moves the rook over, and now b5. He's managed to create two connected pass pawns on the queen side, and he's a pawn up. So this should be winning for black. Okay, but let's be honest. In this position here, who's going to play rook to a5? But bishop to d7, knight to d4, and knight f5. Black is doing quite well here, and he's probably winning in an objective point of view, but he's doing quite well. But Jonathan didn't see that. He saw the chance to try and lash out with queen to b5. Now, the problem is that this takes the defender away from the king side. And Mac now plays a mistake himself. He plays g4. Objectively, rook to e1 is the best move, but okay, let's face it, g4. This really puts some questions to black. Is white really threatening to play g5 and come crushing through like that? Really? Is that possible? Well, in real estate, there's a saying that everything depends on one thing. Location, location, location. In a dogfight, or in this kind of fighting, tactical, time-important chess, there's only one thing that matters. That's pressure, pressure, and pressure. And with this kind of chess, as with a dogfight, the game's not over until you see the rockets coming out from under the seat of your enemy as his plane's floating away from him. You got to keep the pressure on. And that's what Mac excels at. He's great with applying pressure. All right, black plays queen to a5. He'd like to trade queens. He's being very nice about it. But Mac doesn't want to have anything to do with a queen trade. Yeah, when you're the attacker, you want to keep your pieces, especially your queen, and keep harassing the enemy. All right, a3. That little pawn could be a problem. Bishop c3. Queen to d8. Thinking he got back in the nick of time. He probably did, but bishop to a2. Now, this is Mac's first solid defensive move in the whole game. We're at move 29, and it's really the only defensive move he's made. I think that's pretty impressive. Now, during the game, I thought the rook a6 was the move here. He played queen to e8. Let's go back and look at rook to a6. This is the idea to offer some lateral defense. Now, if bishop c4, well, first of all, if bishop to a1, then we get bishop to e6, and I think that black is doing extremely well here, to say the least. This is the idea of bringing the rook to a6. So bishop c4, try and chase that rook away. Now rook to a4, and if bishop to b3, then rook takes e4 is the idea. Queen takes e4, and bishop takes c5, simplifying and being two pawns up, yielding good winning prospects for black. White still has an outside chance at some attack, but black is starting to consolidate things. In the game, though, he played queen to e8, trying to come over to the king side as quickly as possible. Rook to e1, looking for a discovered pin on the e-file. Bishop to d7, and now knight e to g5. A very interesting looking move. Now, I don't know how much time Jonathan had to think at this point. As I recall, he was running low on time, so he didn't have enough time. By this time, we're at move 31, and I know Mac was down to just a few minutes. I know Jonathan had a little bit more time, but as the defender, it's always more tenacious on how you deal with the clock than it is for the attacker. The attacker can whip out an attacking move, usually within a couple seconds, if needed. The defender has to find the exact and demanding one and only moves most of the time in order to stay alive. So here, he should play knight to g8. He didn't. He played bishop to d8. And this is a horrible mistake. Let's go back, though. Knight to g8. And I think that black has good chances to survive here. c6 looks to be the most aggressive continuation after b takes c6. Knight to e6. Bishop takes e6, queen takes e6. Black is up the exchange and two pawns. He'll have to suffer a bit more from this abuse, but as more material is eliminated, he will be closer and closer to winning. Not easy, but it's doable. If you had time on your clock and you didn't feel pursued all the time. So the psychological aspect gets in there too. But bishop d8. And this falls into a slight problem for black. This is a good position to pause and see if you can figure out the best continuation for white here. Okay. Queen to d4 or queen to d3 are both about equal because black now has to give up his queen, but he gets to get rid of 2 attacking pieces in the deal. So it's not horrible for black, but it does yield a pretty good advantage for white. So here he plays the best move. He plays f takes g5. Let's take a step back here. I think that what Mr. Schroer must have miscalculated here was that queen to g6 looks like it's going to hold, but it doesn't. Again, pause the video and see if you can find a continuation for white. But white can win a piece out of this position here. Okay, pretty complex stuff, right? I hope you pause the video. It's a wonderful position. Write it down. Add this to your notebook of positions to study. This is a very interesting one. The point of this being faulty is queen takes g6. Okay, well that seems logical enough. H takes g6. And now the right follow-up is knight to h4. Well, it's threatening mate in one move. So what are the choices here? Well, first of all, what if you take? Well, then there's knight takes g6. King can only go to h7. Now knight takes rook with check. King to h8, knight takes d7. Ooh, that's nasty. White is up a piece and still attacking. All right, what about rook to f7? The idea is to give the king room to run away. Well, here we just take the rook with check. Knight takes and bishop takes f7. Again, white is a piece up. Well, for a pawn, but he's going to get the pawn back. So that didn't work. The only other choice is to bring the knight to f7 with the same idea, given the luft. But knight takes g6, king to g8, knight takes rook, king takes, and now knight takes f7, and voila, white is a piece up yet again. So, yep, back here, white can win a piece. In the game, he played f takes g5, which is the best move. Rook takes queen, bishop takes rook. Okay, at this point, it's like Mac has clipped the enemy's wing, caused his slats to get messed up, but there's no sign of the ejection seat coming out of the plane yet. But he keeps pushing forward, keeps giving the opportunity for mistakes to happen. He plays knight to e5, and he sets up for another shot. And now bishop to f6 was played, and this doesn't quite work for black. I think it was better for him to play knight to g8. And the idea is he's going to be able to keep his pawn structure on the king side somewhat intact with this maneuver. Because now if bishop to b1 threatening mate, he can play knight to f6 defending it. And no pawn weaknesses have been created. However, in the game, after bishop f6, I like what Mac did here. He played bishop at b1. And all this does is force the pawn up to g6 to prevent mate. May not seem like much, but we'll see that it really is a lot. And now queen to d6. In just a few brief moments, the game has gone from one of possible survival and possible victory for black to a position where he has one hand on the joystick and the other one clutching the ejection handle. Black plays king to g7. This just hastens the end, but it was already over. The best defense is probably bishop to g7. But it's still very problematic for black after bishop to a2. Now, the threat here is simply queen takes f8, bishop takes f8, and then knight takes g6 with mate. Very pretty mate. So, based on this, black has to do something that will block the diagonal, guard g6, and get the rook off the vulnerable f8 square. There's only one move that fits all those billings, and that's rook f6. And now we have knight takes g6, check. Very pretty move. It has to be calculated out well because there's a lot of different variations that could be done. So let's take a look at pawn takes knight first. Now we get bishop takes rook. Now, if bishop f7 here, bishop takes g7, king takes queen e5, king h7, queen e7, rook to e8, queen takes b7, king to g8, queen a6, rook checks, king g2, bishop takes a2, queen takes g6, king f8, queen takes knight, check, king f7, queen h7, king e8, queen d3, and now that pawn's going to go running forward, and black will have a hard time stopping it. And the pawn on a3 is going to drop. So this should be a pretty easy win for white. Now, instead of bishop f7 in this variation, if you tried bishop c6, then we got a similar continuation. Bishop takes, king takes, queen e7, king to h8, queen takes g5, hitting the knight, king h7, queen e7, king h8, bishop to b1, threatens to take on g6 and mate on h7, rook to g8, now g5, knight has to move, bishop takes f5, pawn takes, queen f6, this is a cute little roundabout way here, rook to g7, now g6 threatens queen to f8, rook to g8, queen to h6 mate, so bishop to d5, queen to h4 going the other way. If he interposes with the rook, rook to h7, we go queen takes h7 mate, or king to g8, queen to d8 mate. Alright, so we just looked at pawn takes on g6. What about rook takes on g6? Well, queen to f8, check. Knight drops back, and queen takes g8, mate. That's not good. And lastly, bishop takes g8. It's got to get out of check. Queen takes f6. And if he takes the queen, bishop takes f6 is mate. Very pretty. Rook to g8. Now simply queen to f3. And then after something like bishop f7, bishop takes, knight takes, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, queen takes b7. White will have no trouble rounding up the pawn on a3, and the c pawn will be a real problem for black. This should not be much of a problem for white to handle. One more point here at queen to d6 that Mac had just played. If black were to play bishop c6, we have knight takes g6, pawn takes, bishop takes f6, king to g8, now bishop to e5, and black's king is just too exposed. He won't live much longer. So after Mac's move in the game, queen to d6, black played king to g7. Like I said, this just hastens the end. And now Mac makes a pretty bad mistake himself. Plays knight takes g6. And it's a pity, because knight to d7 wins handily. It's a proper way to close out the game. Now, what are the choices here? If he tries rook to f7, then knight takes f6. Rook to a6, nice try at a lateral defense. Now we get knight to d7 with discovered check, king to g8, queen to e5. Threatens mate in two different ways. Rook a to f6, knight takes rook, and mate will be coming soon. So after knight to d7, he can try taking it. And now queen to e7, rook to f7, bishop takes f6. That's why the queen went to e7, not taking the bishop on d7. King to g8, and now the coup de grace. Bishop to a2, pinning the rook on f7. Now bishop to c6, bishop takes g5, rook to e8, queen to f6. That rook's still pinned, so we can go there. Rook to e1, king comes up, and check again. King goes up, and check one more time. King goes to h4. The checks are over, and so is the game. Black loses material on his next move, and the game. But fortunately for black, Mac plays a move that opens the door a bit for him. He plays knight takes g6. It's a flashy move. It's pretty. It's exciting. It's not the best. But again, from the mindset of a player of this style, you're still creating positions where your opponent can make mistakes. So in that sense, it's okay. But on a technical sense, he missed the best shot. Now, he plays bishop takes g6, which is not the best move. And look at this. Wouldn't you take the knight? Who wouldn't? But the best move here is rook to f7. And this actually saves the game for black. Knight to e5. Rook to d8. That is the hard move to see. You're kicking the queen out of there. Now the threat is if the queen just goes anywhere willy-nilly, rook to d1 check, king moves and rook takes b1, and that pawn on a3 becomes a danger. So white has to play queen to b6 here, protecting the bishop. And after the rook checks, king to g2, rook to e7, and presto magico. He's managed to get out of this without losing any material. Nominally speaking, he's got the 2 rooks for the queen, and black seems to be better here. He has good fighting chances, but he misses it. That's the problem. When you're pursued for so long in a game, you lose objectivity and you start to doubt your position. You stop looking for things that could even reverse the trend. So here he played bishop takes on g6, and now queen to e7 check is winning the game easily. Now I can just imagine black being the pilot of the plane that's being pursued, and he's been shot a couple times. He's tried to blow the ejection seat, but the canopy won't open, and the cockpit is filling up with smoke. He has to pull out his knife to try and cut through the canopy, only to realize he hasn't sharpened that knife in 6 years. Desperate situation for black. Now he plays rook to f7, but there's no saving the game no matter what. If king to h8, then we're going to get bishop takes on g6, pawn takes, bishop takes f6, and we can see that this is just going to be a rout. Once this happens, pawn falls, the pawn on c5 is going to be a big problem for black. White's winning easily. Or if king to g8, not much difference here, bishop to a2 check. Now if bishop f7, queen takes here, we're looking to force mate. And if rook to f7, queen takes f6, we're threatening mate again. You can try here, but now queen to h8. And obviously if king to e7, we can take this rook. So he has to try knight to g8. But here we get c6. The idea is to bring the bishop to b4. And that's going to win material. The knight on g8, for example, if b takes c6, we do this. Winning gobs of material. So the only choice here is to block that bishop from coming to b4 with rook to a4. There's a problem with this. Bishop takes, and now pawn takes. And sadly, the rook cannot guard the pawn from promoting. Black will still crash and burn here. So after queen to e7 check in the game, Jonathan played rook to f7, bishop takes bishop on f6, king to g8, bishop to a2, pinning and winning the rook, and bishop to b1. This is just buying him some time so he can finish cutting open the canopy and jump out of the plane manually. Bishop takes f7, knight takes f7, queen takes b7, hitting the rook and the bishop, rook to e8, and he finally gets free from the aircraft, but queen takes b1, the tail splits him in two. Black resigned at this point. Okay, I had some fun bringing you this game with the analogies and stuff. I know it made it a bit longer, but I wanted to get my payback at all these people that go. The fight is a real chess match. No, it's not. The guys are trying to beat each other's brains in. It's pretty simple. It doesn't require any complex thinking at all. You hit the guy, he hits you. You hit him, you try and avoid being hit by him. That's the whole goal of boxing. It is a bit of salute to the veterans that are the flyboys out there. You guys are awesome. I miss working with you guys. They made this video rather long, and I apologize for that. Alright, I hope you enjoyed the video, though. So, to recap, the Arizona Scorpions made it to the playoffs. They're in the 3rd position for the Western Division, which should give them the color odds. I'm not sure. We'll have to see how that plays out. And I can't wait to see the lineups. I wish they had them up right now, but they don't. I'm going to check one more time before I close this video out. And nope, I just checked. There's no pairings up yet. But that will happen on the 14th. The Scorpions will take on the St. Louis Archbishops for the 2nd time this year. And hopefully they can keep their streak going and continue climbing the ladder in the playoffs. So the Western quarterfinals will be on Wednesday the 14th. Now the Eastern quarterfinals will be held on Monday the 12th. So be sure to tune in to the ICC or chess.com so that you can watch those games. And again, if you don't manage to catch the games, you can always go to chessleague.com, to uschessleague.com, And they have replayable games in there, so you can look at all the games from the year. You can also read their posts. You can read my Scorpion's Pit blog as well. I encourage everybody to take advantage of this work that Greg has put into making the Chess League happen and to support it in its future growth. All right, that's it for me for now, and until next time, good luck.